The rain had begun at dusk, and had not ceased since, falling in a thin, steady curtain that blurred the lamps along Marrowfield Lane and turned the gravel drive of Hawthorne House into a glistening ribbon. Inside, however, there was warmth, light, and the gentle murmur of conversation, for the house had gathered guests that evening, old friends, new acquaintances, and those who existed somewhere between the two. Hawthorne House was famous for its hospitality, and even more so for its mistress, Mrs. Eliza Hawthorne, whose smile was said to charm even the most suspicious of hearts. Yet among those who knew her well, there was always a curious remark that her smiles were not always the same. Some were warm, some cold, and somehow no one could quite explain why left one uneasy. At precisely 9:30, a scream shattered the evening. It came from the upper floor, sharp and raw, and cut through the music like broken glass. Chairs scraped, glasses fell, and the guests rushed toward the grand staircase. The butler, pale and rigid, tried to maintain order, but the tide of alarm had already surged. They found the door to Mrs. Hawthorne's private sitting room locked from the inside. There were frantic knocks, urgent calls, and finally the decision was made to break the door. When it gave way, the scene within seemed almost absurd in its simplicity. Mrs. Hawthorne lay on the carpet near the hearth, her hand outstretched as if reaching for something that was no longer there. There was no sign of struggle. The windows were latched. The fireplace burned low and steady. No weapon could be seen. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the doctor among the guests stepped forward, knelt, and after a brief examination, rose with grave certainty. She was dead. The room itself told no story. The desk was neat, the ornaments undisturbed, the carpet unmarked. The only irregularity lay on the small round table beside her chair. There, placed with delicate care, rested a single porcelain mask. It was white, smooth, and painted with a gentle, pleasant smile. No one recognized it. The mask was not part of the house. The servants swore it. The guests denied any knowledge. Yet there it was, as though it had always belonged. The police arrived before midnight, their boots echoing through the silent corridors. Inspector Lavington, a patient man with weary eyes, listened to the accounts and examined the room again and again. Locked door. No hidden passage. No poison found in her drink. No wound upon her body. Death, the doctor suggested, might have been caused by something subtle, perhaps a rare toxin, perhaps the heart itself, but nothing could yet be proven. The guests were gathered in the drawing-room, their earlier elegance replaced by strained composure. They spoke in low voices, watched one another, and avoided the staircase. Each had been in the house for hours. Each had an opportunity. None had motive that could be easily seen. "What of the mask?" the inspector asked for the 5th time. Again silence. At last the youngest guest, Miss Clara Benton, spoke with hesitation. "It looks familiar," she said, "but I cannot say why." The inspector lifted the mask carefully. The smile seemed harmless, almost kind, yet under the lamplight it appeared strangely fixed, as though it concealed more than it revealed. "It is a theatrical piece," he murmured. But from where? No theatre in the city had reported such a prop. No artisan admitted to crafting it. There were no fingerprints upon it, no trace of dust or travel. It was as clean as though it had been made that very hour. The strangest fact, however, emerged just before dawn. Mrs. Hawthorne's maid, trembling and exhausted, revealed that earlier that evening her mistress had dismissed her with unusual haste. As the girl left, she had heard Mrs. Hawthorne speaking to someone in the room. But when the door was broken, there had been no one inside. And the final detail, which troubled the inspector more than all the rest, was this. When the body had been found, Mrs. Hawthorne's face wore a smile identical to the one painted upon the mask. The following morning brought no relief to Hawthorne House. The rain had softened into a grey mist that clung to the lawns and pressed against the tall windows like a silent witness. Inside, the guests moved carefully, their voices lowered, their eyes shadowed with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Inspector Lavington had already begun his methodical work, questioning each person again, noting times, movements, and contradictions. Yet the case remained stubbornly unchanged. A locked room. No weapon, no clear cause. And that smile. It was near 11 when a small, elegant motorcar arrived at the gates. The butler, who had long ago learned to suppress surprise, nonetheless allowed himself the slightest widening of the eyes when the visitor stepped out. The man was of modest height, impeccably dressed, with a neat moustache that seemed to command respect by its very precision. He carried himself with quiet assurance, and though his manner was gentle, there was in his gaze something keen and unyielding. "I am expected," he said politely. Within minutes, Inspector Lavington found himself greeting Hercule Poirot in the drawing-room. The inspector had worked with him once before and remembered well the discomfort of seeing an impossible case unravel under that courteous scrutiny. "You believe this matter complicated?" Poirot asked. "I believe it insoluble," Lavington replied. Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, then it is most interesting." He listened first. He always listened. The inspector explained the events, the mask, the maid's testimony, the locked door. Poirot asked questions so small that they seemed almost irrelevant. The hour of the scream, the order of arrival, who stood nearest the staircase, who spoke first, who said nothing. When at last he was taken to the sitting-room, he paused at the threshold as though greeting an old acquaintance. His eyes moved slowly, absorbing the space. The body had been removed, yet its absence seemed almost as powerful as its presence had been. "The mask," he said. It was handed to him. He turned it in the light, examining the glaze, the brushstrokes, the faint irregularities. Then, unexpectedly, he placed it upon the table exactly as it had been found and stepped back. "It smiles," he murmured, but not kindly. The inspector watched, trying to read the little man's thoughts. Poirot began to move about the room. He touched nothing, yet noticed everything. The alignment of the chairs, the angle of the writing desk, the ashes in the hearth. He stopped suddenly beside the carpet where Mrs. Hawthorne had fallen. "Here," he said softly. The inspector frowned. "We have examined that area thoroughly." "Yes, but not, perhaps, with the correct eyes." Poirot crouched and pointed to a minute disturbance in the fibers so slight it might have been caused by the pressure of a shoe, or perhaps the dragging of something light. "It is recent," he said, "and yet no struggle. Curious." He rose and moved toward the door. He examined the lock, the hinges, the frame. Perfect. No tampering. Then, with sudden interest, he turned to the guests who had been brought to observe. "Mademoiselle Benton," he said gently, "you found the mask familiar." She hesitated. "I thought so, but I cannot remember where." Poirot studied her face. "Memory is a shy creature. It comes when it is not forced." As he spoke, his gaze shifted very briefly to a man standing near the window. Mr. Adrian Hale, a distant cousin of the deceased. The man's expression was composed, but his hand tightened almost imperceptibly upon the back of a chair. Poirot noticed. He crossed the room abruptly and addressed him. "Monsieur Hale, you were fond of your cousin?" "Of course. And yet you do not mourn as the others do." The man stiffened. "That is an absurd accusation." "Not accusation. Observation." The tension in the room sharpened. Poirot's attention moved again, this time to a small object upon the mantelpiece, a silver cigarette case. He opened it, glanced inside, and smiled faintly. "You smoke, Inspector?" "Number." "And Madame Hawthorne?" "Never." Poirot closed the case and returned it. "Then why," he said quietly, "is there fresh tobacco ash in a room where no one present admits to smoking?" No one answered. But in that silence, the first true shadow of deception entered the house. Poirot spent the afternoon listening. He did not take notes in the conventional sense. He relied on something far subtler, careful reading of expressions, of hesitations, of the tiny inconsistencies that speak louder than words. One by one, the guests were called into the drawing-room. Each offered an account of the evening, yet none perfectly aligned with the others, and none quite matched the bare facts the inspector had established. First was Miss Clara Benton. She described entering the room to fetch a book for Mrs. Hawthorne, noticing nothing amiss, and then hearing the scream. She insisted she had not touched the mask, nor had she noticed anyone carrying anything unusual. Her eyes darted occasionally toward Mr. Adrian Hale, as if unconsciously seeking reassurance, and Poirot noted the way her hands fidgeted with a sleeve. There was truth in her account, but truth filtered through fear is rarely complete. Next came Mr. Hale himself, his tone polished, carefully measured. He recalled speaking with Mrs. Hawthorne about an upcoming charity event and then returning to the lounge. "I did not leave the company of the others afterward," he said. Yet when pressed, he could not recall where he had stood when the scream was heard. Poirot observed the slight tension in his jaw, the controlled twitch of his left hand, small betrayals of memory or of something more deliberate. The housekeeper, Mrs. Linton, was next. Her voice was firm, rehearsed almost, as she outlined the movement of servants, the locking of doors, and her own duties. She claimed to have seen nothing unusual and to have maintained strict observation of the lower floors. Yet Poirot's gaze lingered on a tiny smudge on her apron, faint streak of white paint, as though brushed against the mask at some point. He made no comment, only filed it away in the little grey cells. A pattern began to emerge, subtle and almost invisible. The stories were not lies in the usual sense, they were carefully arranged truths, each shaped to protect, to deceive, or perhaps to hide embarrassment. One guest's memory of the hallway contradicted another's one, insisted they had never touched the sitting-room door, yet someone else remembered it swinging ever so slightly. No one had intended to confess anything, yet in the interplay of these half-truths, a picture was beginning to take form. Poirot then summoned the maid who had dismissed Mrs. Hawthorne before the murder. Her story was simple, but her voice wavered under questioning. She spoke of hearing a conversation, of footsteps that seemed out of place, yet she could not identify the speaker. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading. "I thought it was someone joking," she admitted softly. But when I returned, her words faltered. Poirot did not press further immediately, the gaps themselves were telling. Finally he spoke to the elderly Mr. Wentworth, a distant friend of the family. His account was the most perplexing. He insisted he had remained by the piano for the entirety of the evening, playing intermittently to entertain the company. Yet multiple witnesses recalled having seen him near the staircase, or even at the door of the sitting-room, precisely when others claimed he was elsewhere. He smiled when contradictions were pointed out, yet there was a tension beneath it, a carefully concealed irritability, as if he were accustomed to hiding knowledge or misdirecting attention. Poirot listened without interrupting, his eyes moving from one face to the next, catching the flicker of unease, the quick glance, the subtle tightening of fists. Motives were hidden beneath layers of civility. Fear of scandal, jealousy, long-standing grudges, or perhaps the mere desire to protect the reputation of Hawthorne House. No outright confession, no admission of guilt, but in the delicate weaving of these accounts, the detective sensed the first real threads of deception. He stood finally, moving slowly to the empty sitting-room door. "Ah," he murmured, almost to himself. The voices speak, but not in truth. Each one tells a story, yet hides the story behind it. And it is there, hidden, that the answer waits. He turned to the assembled guests, his gaze sweeping over them with quiet precision. "Patience, mes amis. Even the smallest inconsistency has a voice, and I intend to hear it all." The room fell silent. The tension was palpable. In that quiet, Poirot's mind was already moving ahead, tracing invisible paths through conflicting recollections, mapping hidden motives. Somewhere in the carefully guarded words lay the key to unraveling the mystery of the Smileth mask that had arrived like a riddle, and the woman who had worn it even in death. Poirot spent the following hours in quiet contemplation, seated in a high-backed chair near the drawing-room window, the grey mist outside making the lamplight inside seem warmer by contrast. He did not speak much. Instead, he let the murmurs of the house, the shifting footsteps of nervous guests, and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock fill the silence. In his mind, he traced every account he had heard, every hesitation, every flicker of unease. Motives, he knew, were never singular. They tangled, intertwined, overlapped like the branches of the trees swaying outside, each one distinct, yet part of a greater pattern. He began with Mr. Adrian Hale. Wealthy, ambitious, and accustomed to influence, Hale had always hovered at the edges of Mrs. Hawthorne's affairs, offering assistance, advice, even gentle admonitions. Yet there was a subtle tension between them. Poirot recalled the fleeting glances, the almost imperceptible tightening of Hale's jaw during questioning. Was it mere irritation at the attention or a deeper, more personal frustration? Perhaps financial advantage, inheritance, or the preservation of some secret opportunity. Then there was Miss Clara Benton, young, observant, and clearly affected by the events. She was an enigma. Her familiarity with the mask suggested more than casual observation, yet she appeared frightened, almost guilty without cause. Could curiosity, jealousy, or the desire for approval have driven her? Or was her unease merely the natural reaction of someone who had stumbled into a perilous situation? Poirot filed each possibility carefully, noting both the probabilities and the subtle improbabilities. The housekeeper, Mrs. Linton, was more complex than she first seemed. Loyal, rigid, and disciplined, yet her apron bore the faint white streak that matched the mask. Was it accidental, or a sign of deliberate tampering? And her precise memory of events too neat, almost rehearsals, suggested that she was protecting herself, or perhaps someone else. Fear of scandal, perhaps, or loyalty twisted into secrecy. Poirot's mind lingered on the shadows behind her eyes. She had knowledge she was unwilling to reveal. Mr. Wentworth, with his contradictory statements, presented another puzzle. His polished manners concealed irritation, perhaps resentment. He had the alibi of performance, yet witnesses placed him near the scene. Could it be a simple misremembering, or a subtle manipulation of perception to conceal an inconvenient truth? Poirot considered the possibility that Wentworth's motives were entwined with the social hierarchies of the evening, a fear of embarrassment, preservation of reputation, or the satisfaction of control over the gathering. Even the maid, so small and trembling, had her place in the maze. Her knowledge of voices, her fleeting presence near the sitting room before the incident, suggested that she had seen or heard more than she admitted. Perhaps loyalty to her mistress prevented her from speaking fully, perhaps fear of retribution restrained her tongue. Yet Poirot sensed that her silence was purposeful, a single thread in a tapestry carefully arranged to obscure, to mislead, to protect hidden truths. As he reviewed each motive, the detective began to sketch invisible lines connecting them: jealousy linking Benton and Hale, fear uniting the maid and Mrs. Linton, pride entangling Wentworth with the household. There was no single glaring reason for murder. No solitary desire or grievance explained everything. Each motive overlapped another, forming a dense web, a maze in which opportunity, impulse, and intention collided. Greed and revenge, jealousy and fear, all twisted together, sometimes contradicting one another, sometimes reinforcing. Poirot rose and walked slowly toward the sitting-room door, his fingers brushing the polished wood as if drawing the energy of the room into his mind. "Ah," he murmured, "the mask was not merely a mask. It is a symbol, a smile to conceal, to mislead, to hide the intentions that lie beneath. And these intentions, these motives, they are many, yet each points to something next see pass. Somewhere in the interplay of desire and fear, the solution waits." The detective paused, glancing back at the gathered guests. Each of them watched him with quiet apprehension, unaware that the threads they had tried to conceal so carefully were already visible to a mind honed to detect the subtlest of patterns. Slowly, inexorably, the maze of motives was beginning to yield its secrets, and Poirot, patient and unflinching, would follow each path to its end. Late that afternoon, a flurry of excitement swept through Hawthorne House. Inspector Lavington had announced a discovery: a letter, found hidden beneath the floorboard of the sitting room, its edges worn and faintly scented with lavender. The contents were a brief but explosive note in Mrs. Hawthorne's handwriting, referencing a financial dispute with an unnamed relative and hinting at a reckoning soon. The police were jubilant, certain that this document provided the missing link, a motive so explicit it could not be ignored. "Here," Lavington declared to the assembled guests, "we have proof. Someone among you coveted her fortune, and this explains everything." Murmurs rippled through the room, a mix of fear, relief, and accusation. Mr. Hale stiffened, but his composure remained intact. Miss Benton's face went pale, and the maid fidgeted, as though caught between relief and trepidation. Poirot, however, said nothing, his eyes observing more than listening. The inspector began to lay out a chain of reasoning that seemed, on the surface, unassailable. The letter suggested greed, the opportunity was clear, the supposed culprit's presence in the house coincided with the time of death. Lavington even suggested that the mask had been an ill-considered diversion, a theatrical flourish to confuse the household. Guests nodded, some whispering approval, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the audacity of the crime. Poirot lingered at the edge of the gathering, quiet and contemplative. The note was indeed significant, but something about the narrative constructed from it felt incomplete. He returned to the sitting room alone, crouching near the fireplace and examining the floorboards with meticulous care. The letter's placement, its orientation, the slight smudge of dust upon it all seemed too convenient, too neatly discovered. It was as though the crime scene had been subtly rearranged to guide the authorities toward a premature conclusion. He held the letter lightly, noting the faint impression of another handwriting beneath Mrs. Hawthorne's, the ghost of a signature not immediately visible, a second layer almost deliberately obscured. The detective's small, precise brain began to untangle possibilities. Could someone have planted the letter, hoping that greed would appear as motive, that suspicion would fall on the obvious candidate while the true culprit remained hidden? Later, when the inspector returned to declare the case solved to the relieved guests, Poirot allowed a faint smile. He did not contradict Lavington, merely observed the interactions around him, the subtle relief in those whose innocence was apparent, the suppressed anxiety of those who had something to hide, the faint gleam of satisfaction in someone watching the authorities celebrate too soon. "Ah, but Messermes," he said quietly to himself, "victory is a fragile thing, and a victory claimed too early is often the most dangerous of all." He considered the mask, the room, the sequence of events, and the manifold motives he had traced through the day. Each thread he had followed now seemed to vibrate with a hidden energy, a whisper of deceit that had not yet revealed its source. Even as the guests began to relax, believing the worst had passed, Poirot's gaze caught a subtle movement in the far corner of the Hala hand, brushing against the frame of a portrait, the angle of a shadow shifting just slightly. It was almost imperceptible, yet it spoke volumes. Someone in that house was waiting, patient, biding their time, confident that the authorities would be satisfied with the false resolution. Poirot straightened and let his gaze sweep across the room, taking in each expression, each twitch, each nervous glance. The letter was not the key, it was a distraction, a curtain behind which the true architect of Mrs. Hawthorne's death remained concealed. He could feel the tension coiling, like a spring, and he knew the real confrontation had not yet begun. While everyone else celebrated a tidy solution, the murderer watched from the shadows, confident, careful, and utterly aware that Poirot was the only one who might yet unravel the truth. As the evening deepened and the mist returned to the windows, the detective's mind worked steadily, weaving the threads of motive, opportunity, and deception into a pattern that others could not yet see. The house, for all its quiet, was alive with secrets, and Poirot, patient, precise, and inexorably logical, was already one step closer to drawing them out into the cold light of revelation. Late into the night, when the guests had been sent to their rooms and the house had settled into uneasy silence, Poirot remained in the drawing-room, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating his contemplative features. The rain had returned, tapping against the windows in gentle persistence, as though nature itself kept time with the secrets of Hawthorne House. He turned over the details of the evening once more, but it was not the events of the night alone that commanded his attention. Something older, something buried, stirred at the edges of his memory's thread that had been overlooked, dismissed as irrelevant, until now. It began with a casual glance at the family portrait above the mantel. A young Mrs. Hawthorne, radiant and smiling, flanked by a man Poirot recognized not from the present household, but from a distant case file he had studied years ago. A scandal, minor in its day, involving the disappearance of a valuable jewel and a series of threats exchanged among distant relatives. Poirot had noted then how the affair had ended quietly, resolved through secrecy and the quiet persuasion of legal counsel, leaving suspicion lingering but never confirmed. And yet, as he studied the portrait more closely, the resemblance between Mr. Adrian Hale and one of the men involved in that old case struck him with sudden clarity. Connection that had seemed coincidental now revealed itself as deliberate. He called the inspector back into the room, sharing only what was necessary to guide the inquiry without alarming the household. "Lantian affair," he murmured, pointing to the portrait. "A past incident, long thought closed, and yet its shadow falls upon us tonight. Look carefully at the faces of those involved now. You will see the same tensions, the same old rivalries. The past does not die. It waits hidden to surface when the conditions are right." Poirot began to trace relationships that had seemed superficial. The maid's family had once served in the same estate where the old scandal had taken place. A coincidence dismissed at the time, but now significant. Miss Benton's uncle had been a friend and legal adviser to one of the original disputants. Even Mrs. Linton's own career, so strictly devoted to household service, had been shaped by knowledge of the old feud. Slowly, a network emerged, connections between the guests, the servants, and the events of that long-forgotten dispute. Each link was subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable under Poirot's meticulous examination. The mask, the letter, the carefully constructed alibis, all these were more than distractions, they were echoes of schemes and rivalries begun years before. Mrs. Hawthorne's charm and influence had unwittingly reopened old wounds, and in doing so, she had exposed herself to the resentments that had lain dormant, hidden behind smiles and politeness. The reckoning hinted at in her letter was not merely financial, it was the culmination of grievances nurtured across decades, the long shadows of history converging in a single tragic evening. Poirot paced slowly, recalling every conversation, every contradiction, every moment of hesitation he had observed earlier. The interplay of fear, pride, and ambition made perfect sense now. Mr. Hale's subtle tension, Miss Benton's nervous glances, Mrs. Linton's faintly smudged apron, all became intelligible as traces of past entanglements. The past had not merely influenced the present, it had shaped it, constraining actions, manipulating perceptions, and orchestrating a tableau in which each player acted according to an inherited script, unaware that a patient detective was seeing the story unfold in its entirety. He sat back and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, though careful to conceal it. The true elegance of the crime, he realized, lay in its blending of old resentments with new opportunity, the weaving together of generations into a single, subtle design. "Ah," he murmured to himself, "the present is but a mirror of the past, nests pass, and it is by understanding the past that one can illuminate the shadows which hide the truth." Outside, the rain intensified, streaking the windows with silver threads, as if marking the passage of time itself. Poirot knew that the revelation of these hidden connections was only the beginning. The shadow of history had opened a door, and through it, the final pieces of the puzzle would soon step into the light, one by one. By the following morning, Hawthorne House had settled into a tense routine. Guests moved with quiet caution, each glance and gesture weighed as if it might reveal hidden motives. Poirot, however, remained calm, his mind alive with patterns, possibilities, and the faint pulse of deception. He had spent the night considering the tangled web of past grievances, present anxieties, and the subtle interactions that had hinted at the truth. Now, it was time to test the fragile facades of those around him. Poirot called the guests into the drawing-room, a casual air of politeness, masking the intensity of his intent. "Mess Amis," he began, "we have discussed motives, timelines, and memories. But sometimes the truth speaks not through words, but through action or inaction." He reached for the mask, placing it gently on the central table, as though inviting conversation without demanding it. A small exercise, if you will. Observe, respond, and reveal. He addressed each guest in turn, framing questions in an unexpected way, posing subtle scenarios designed not to accuse, but to provoke instinctive reactions. He asked them to imagine themselves in the sitting room at the moment of Mrs. Hawthorne's death, to recall what they would notice first, how they would respond, and what they would prioritize. Each answer seemed harmless, yet Poirot's attention was acute, noting pauses, shifts in posture, even micro-expressions. Miss Benton responded with nervous sincerity, describing the room as she had seen it, focusing on the mask, the warmth of the fire, the position of the furniture. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying her anxiety, yet her memory remained consistent with what Poirot had observed. She revealed no duplicity, only fear of blame, of consequence, and perhaps of being misunderstood. Poirot turned then to Mr. Adrian Hale, his gaze gentle but unwavering. "And you, monsieur, what would you do, finding yourself suddenly alone with Madame Hawthorne in that room?" Hale's response was immediate, overly precise. He spoke of observing her gestures, ensuring her comfort, even imagining the proper social etiquette for addressing a lady in distress. Yet as he spoke, Poirot noticed something minute, but revealing a flicker of irritation in his eye, a tightening of the hand that rested on the back of a chair. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but enough for the little grey cells to register. This was a man rehearsing control, not recounting truth. The detective's tactic was deliberate. By framing the inquiry as hypothetical, he bypassed the conscious defenses of the mind, drawing out instinctual reactions that were difficult to mask. When the questions moved to interactions with other guests, Hale's composure wavered again. His eyes darted to Mrs. Linton, then to the maid, then back to the mask. A subtle shift, a micro-expression, an almost involuntary twitching spoke volumes of discomfort, of the tension between his narrative and reality. Poirot did not rush to accusation. He observed the reactions of the others as well, noting which faces remained steady, which minds betrayed themselves through hesitation, which gestures revealed hidden thoughts. The room became a theatre of concealed truths, each participant performing, yet unable entirely to hide instinctive reactions. Finally, Poirot leaned forward, hands clasped, voice quiet, but intense. "Ah, Messermise," he murmured, "the mask is more than ornament. It is a mirror, reflecting not only the face but the soul. And when the soul is troubled, even the finest mask may falter." He let the words hang, silent and potent, while eyes flickered, breaths caught, and subtle tension rippled through the room. In that moment, he saw it the first real crack in the carefully maintained facade. Hale's composure, his meticulous answers, the precise control of his demeanor could not hide the smallest betrayal. A rapid blink, a half-formed grimace, the shift of weight that suggested inner conflict. The man who had seemed so composed, so untouchable, had revealed in a single instant that he carried a fragment of guilt, or at least of knowledge, that he could not entirely conceal. Poirot smiled faintly, satisfied. The unconventional method had worked. Words alone had not sufficed, but by turning the investigation into a subtle psychological test, he had drawn from the guilty instinctual evidence that no interrogation could have forced. The game was still unfolding, but now, at last, a tangible thread of deception had emerged, a thread that would soon guide the detective to the heart of the mystery and to the person behind the false smiles. The morning air was crisp and biting, carrying the faint tang of rain-soaked earth into the drawing-room as Poirot arrived to continue his scrutiny. The house was quiet, the guests subdued, yet tension thrummed beneath every surface. He had spent hours the previous evening tracing subtle reactions, following the thread of instinct and deception that had begun to reveal the guilty mind. Now he intended to examine the physical evidence once more, confident that each object, each placement, could yield further insight. He moved first to the sitting room, where the mask still rested on the table. Its porcelain surface gleamed in the early light, smooth and inscrutable, yet no less telling for all its perfection. Poirot examined the floor, the furniture, the small imperfections in the carpet that had hinted at a disturbance the night of the murder. Then he bent to inspect the spot where the floorboard letter had been discovered, the letter that Inspector Lavington had so eagerly claimed as the key to the case. It was gone. Poirot froze, carefully restraining the flicker of irritation that threatened to betray his immediate recognition of the severity. The floorboard had been lifted, the letter removed without trace. No fingerprints, no residual marks, simply vanished. A trick of sleight or premeditation, it was impossible to tell. The inspector, summoned immediately, arrived with hurried steps, eyes wide. "It was here," he exclaimed. "It cannot have gone anywhere. Perhaps a mistake." Poirot shook his head gently, calm but unyielding. "None, Inspector. It is no mistake. Someone has taken great care to remove this evidence, yes, to remove the narrative you hoped to construct. And in doing so, they presumed to slow the progress of the investigation. The implications were immediate and grave. Someone within the house or with access to it was actively working to misdirect, to cover tracks before the truth could emerge." The detective's gaze swept across the assembled guests, noting the subtle reactions, the tightening of jaws, the slight stiffening of posture, the faint glances exchanged. Fear, surprise, and irritation mingled in a tableau of unease. Poirot turned his attention back to the room. The mask, the furniture, even the hearth each remained as it had been, yet the absence of the letter created a void that spoke more loudly than words. A carefully planted clue had been removed, a crucial pivot in the investigation snatched from the grasp of those seeking justice. And yet, the removal itself was evidence of a deliberate act, betraying impatience, recklessness, or overconfidence on the part of the perpetrator. He summoned the maid and Mrs. Linton. Their accounts were repeated, checked, and scrutinized. Neither admitted to having moved the letter, and Poirot observed no immediate sign of deceit. Yet he felt it in the tension of their breathing, the almost imperceptible hesitation in their speech. Someone in this house was willing to act decisively to protect the guilty party, to interfere with the orderly unfolding of truth. As he walked from room to room, inspecting doors, windows, and cupboards, Poirot reflected on the audacity of the theft. It was not merely an attempt to obscure motive, it was a challenge, a statement. The perpetrator believed themselves clever enough to remain one step ahead of even the most meticulous detective. The stakes had risen sharply, and trust had become fragile, brittle as glass. No gesture could now be accepted at face value, no account assumed entirely accurate. Every shadow, every glance, every hesitation might conceal an act of deception or reveal it. By late afternoon, Poirot had returned to the drawing-room, mask in hand, mind alive with possibilities. "Ah," he murmured quietly, to himself more than anyone else, "when the evidence vanishes, the mind must illuminate the path. The thief, the deceiver, they act with boldness, yes, but boldness is not subtlety. And in their confidence there is weakness." His eyes swept over the guests once more. The threads were still tangled, the motives still overlapping, yet a pattern was emerging. The true criminal had made a mistake, leaving behind something far more telling than a mere letter. And Poirot knew that once uncovered, it would shine a light strong enough to pierce even the most carefully maintained mask. The house had grown unnervingly quiet by evening. Guests lingered in corners, moving cautiously, their earlier relief replaced by a lingering unease. Even the rain had softened into a light drizzle, tapping intermittently against the windows, as though marking the tension that filled the rooms. Poirot, calm but alert, continued to study the subtle interactions among the inhabitants, tracing the invisible lines of fear, deceit, and ambition that connected them all. Just as he had begun to formulate the next steps, a sudden commotion erupted from the upper floor. A piercing scream, sharper and more urgent than the one that had signaled Mrs. Hawthorne's death, cut through the house like a blade. Poirot was on his feet instantly, heart steady, instincts alert. Guests rushed toward the sound, panic and confusion mingling in their hurried footsteps. In the library, the scene that greeted him was shocking in its simplicity and horror. Mr. Wentworth, the elderly man whose contradictions had piqued Poirot's suspicion earlier, lay slumped across the floor, a heavy bookcase tilted precariously behind him. The edges of the case had struck him with force, leaving him unconscious, or perhaps worse. His hand was still curled around a small slip of paper that had fallen from the top shelf, scrawled with a single line, "Not all masks are worn on the face." Poirot knelt immediately, examining both the man and the surrounding area. There were no signs of struggle beyond the toppling of the bookcase. No weapon, no blood, only the obvious violence of the fall. Yet the detective's keen eyes noted the deliberate placement of the case, the slight tilt in the floor beneath it, and the fact that the slip of paper had been left in such a position that it would almost certainly be noticed by anyone entering the room. This was no accident, it was a message and a warning. The guests gathered in the hallway, pale and trembling. Some whispered about curses, others about an unsettled spirit, but Poirot's mind worked quickly, unclouded by superstition. He observed the reactions. Fear, yes, but also something sharper, calculated concern. Someone in the house wanted to destabilize the investigation, to instill panic, to create confusion. The villain was still in control, still several steps ahead. He addressed the assembly with calm authority. "Mess Amis, what has happened here is not mere chance. This is the work of one who understands the house, its habits, and your fears. The previous crime, the letter, the carefully orchestrated alibis was only a beginning. Now the pattern changes. The criminal escalates. And we must respond in kind, with vigilance, reasoning, and observation." Poirot carefully retrieved the slip of paper from Wentworth's hand, noting the handwriting and subtle differences from the previous note. Someone had deliberately left a clue that was both cryptic and revealing, a psychological maneuver designed to provoke curiosity, fear, and misdirection. The detective understood immediately. The perpetrator wanted attention, wanted the investigation to move in a direction of their choosing. He inspected the bookcase, testing its stability, observing the marks on the floor. and carefully reconstructing the movement required to topple it in such a precise manner. Only someone with intimate knowledge of the room could have arranged it so, and that meant the villain was still inside the house, confident, patient, and daring. Poirot turned to the guests, his gaze sweeping across their anxious faces. "The criminal is not gone," he said softly, almost to himself, "and will not remain idle. We must watch, listen, and anticipate. The next move may come at any moment." The implication hung heavy in the air. No one was safe, and every action, every word, every glance was now a potential clue or a deliberate deception. Outside, the mist deepened, curling around the grounds of Hawthorne House like a living thing. Inside, Poirot felt the thrill of the hunt sharpen around him. The mystery had shifted, the stakes had risen, and the game had grown far more dangerous. The villain had struck again, but Poirot knew that with patience, logic, and observation, the shadows could still be penetrated and the truth at last revealed. The house had grown tense and hushed in the wake of the bookcase incident. Guests lingered in the hallways, whispering to one another with furtive glances, each fearful that the next calamity might strike without warning. Poirot, however, moved calmly through the rooms, his eyes absorbing every detail, his mind turning over the fragments of evidence, the inconsistencies, and the fleeting gestures that had caught his attention in earlier questioning. In chaos, he found clarity. In confusion, he sought the pattern. He returned to the sitting room first, where the mask still rested on the table, unchanged in its silent provocation. Poirot crouched near the hearth, examining the floor carefully. Something he had noticed during the first examination now demanded attention. The faint indentation in the carpet, a subtle mark that had seemed inconsequential at the time. It was precisely where Mrs. Hawthorne had fallen, yet it was repeated, faintly, at the far side of the room, an echo of movement, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable under scrutiny. Then he remembered a comment from Miss Benton, made lightly as the investigation progressed, about the arrangement of the sitting-room chairs. How the leftmost chair always seemed slightly askew, never quite aligned with the others. At the time, Poirot had filed it as a trivial observation, nothing more than a quirk of housekeeping. Now, under the weight of recent events, the missing letter, the masked message, the bookcase attack, the significance became clear. The slight misalignment marked a deliberate path, a sequence of actions that the murderer had followed repeatedly, leaving imperceptible traces that no one else had noticed. Poirot's gaze moved from the chair to the fireplace, the desk, and then to the edges of the carpet, where the subtle patterns of disturbance repeated. The mask, the letters, the small slips of paper, all were not random. Each had been placed to create misdirection, yet each bore a signature of movement. The steps taken by the perpetrator, the subtle deviations from ordinary behavior, the unconscious gestures that betrayed knowledge and intent. The pattern had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, observable only to one with patience, attention, and a mind attuned to subtleties. He called the guests together once more, asking them to recall the small, almost irrelevant details of their movements in the sitting room, their conversations, their reactions to the mask. One by one, they revealed minor discrepancies: who had touched which chair, who had turned at which angle, who had looked at the mantelpiece and then quickly away. These fragments, previously dismissed as insignificant, now aligned like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, forming a sequence of human behavior that was deliberate, intentional, and revealing. Poirot's gaze lingered on Mr. Adrian Hale, whose reactions throughout the morning had been the most guarded. The pattern of small motions, the repeated glances at the leftmost chair, the instinctive steps that corresponded with the marks on the carpet, now pointed unambiguously to him. Each minor act, each hesitation, each subtle movement that had seemed incidental, had in fact been part of a carefully orchestrated performance, one designed to mislead, to intimidate, and to conceal. The detective straightened, a faint smile playing upon his lips. "Ah, yes. Yes, it is all here," he murmured. The story has been told through gestures, through placement, through attention to the smallest details. It is not the words, not the alibis, but the actions, repeated and slightly varied, that reveal the truth. The room, still shrouded in unease, seemed to respond to the realization. The storm outside had softened, the rain now a steady drizzle, yet inside, tension held like a taut wire. Poirot's mind worked rapidly, linking the pattern of small movements with the sequence of earlier deceptions. The mask, the letters, the stolen evidence, and the deliberate attempt to misdirect. Every clue, every detail now had its place, and every motion pointed inexorably toward the person who had orchestrated the crimes from the shadows. In that quiet moment, with the faint scent of damp and candle wax in the air, Poirot understood fully. The solution had not been hidden in some grand revelation, but in the subtle, overlooked minutiae of human behavior. The pattern emerged, precise and undeniable, and with it, the path to unmasking the culprit lay open, ready to be followed to its inevitable conclusion. Poirot called the guests once more into the drawing-room, his movements measured, calm and deliberate, as if the very walls of Hawthorne House were part of his reasoning. The mask sat on the table, inert yet accusatory, a silent witness to every misstep, every deception. The detective's eyes swept across the room, noting the taut expressions, the restless fingers, the careful avoidance of each other's gaze. Each subtle gesture, each tremor in posture, was a note in the symphony of human behavior he had been deciphering since the investigation began. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice gentle but insistent, "we have followed the path of actions, the pattern of gestures, the trail of deception, and now, at last, the final piece of the puzzle may be revealed." He paused, letting the words hang, allowing the tension in the room to mount. "It is not wealth, not petty jealousy, not the ordinary grievances that have led to tragedy. No, it is something far more profound." He turned slowly toward Mr. Adrian Hale, whose composure had been tested throughout the morning. The man's eyes flickered, subtle yet telling, as he realized that the detective's gaze was unflinching, deliberate, and fully discerning. Poirot held up the mask, its fixed smile catching the lamplight. "You see, this mask, it is not simply an object, nor is it a diversion. It represents the duplicity of appearances, the control of perception, and it has been central to our understanding of the crime." Poirot's fingers traced the edge of the table, then rested on the chair that had been left slightly askew. "Monsieur Hale," he said, "your careful movements, the glances, the seemingly minor adjustments, these were all calculated to maintain an illusion. You sought not only to commit a crime, but to manipulate those around you, to make them believe in a narrative of greed, a tale of petty revenge." Hale's lips tightened, the first true crack in his mask of calm. "Yet the deeper motive," Poirot continued, "is something that could not be obscured by letters or objects. It is obsession, not with wealth, nor with status, but with control. You admired Mrs. Hawthorne? Yes, but not in the ordinary sense. You were compelled by her mind, her influence, her ability to shape the lives around her. You could not tolerate the idea that anyone else might wield power, attention, or affection she offered. And when she chose her own path, the path you could not dictate, your desire turned into something darker." Hale's hand twitched involuntarily, the air seemed to thicken around him. Poirot stepped closer, his eyes unwavering. "This is why the mask was so important, why the placement of objects, the careful timing, the misdirectional were necessary to you. The crime was not simply to remove her physically, but to assert dominion over reality itself, to force the world to align with your expectations, to bend perception to your will." The detective let silence fill the room for a moment, allowing the gravity of the revelation to settle. "Obsession," he murmured, "a mind so consumed that ordinary motives appear insufficient. It is this relentless, overpowering need to control that led to murder, to deception, to manipulation of everyone present." Hale's posture collapsed slightly, the proud facade crumbling under the weight of exposure. The twisted psychology, the hidden compulsion, had been invisible to the casual observer but was laid bare under Poirot's scrutiny. You could not accept uncertainty, and in your attempt to eliminate it, you created a chain of events so intricate that even trained minds were misled until now. Poirot's gaze swept over the room one last time, calm, resolute, and inexorably precise. The mind, when driven by obsession, will create patterns and illusions to satisfy its own desire. And here, in Hawthorne House, that desire manifested in crime, in manipulation, and in tragedy. Now we understand the why, not merely the how, and with understanding comes the path to justice. The revelation hung heavy in the air. The guests absorbed it, some in shock, others with quiet comprehension, yet all aware of the depth of darkness that had operated under the veneer of civility. Poirot, serene as ever, replaced the mask on the table. It was no longer just a symbol of mystery. It was the silent testament to a mind consumed by a desire far more chilling than any ordinary motive and the consequences it had wrought in the world around it. Poirot waited until the evening shadows had thickened, settling over Hawthorne House like a velvet curtain, before making his move. He summoned the remaining guests to the drawing-room, presenting the appearance of a routine gathering, while the detective quietly arranged the scene according to a plan only he fully understood. The mask lay at the center of the table, now more a tool of revelation than mere decoration. Chairs were slightly shifted, pathways through the room subtly marked, and the air itself seemed to hum with quiet expectation. Mr. Adrian Hale entered with practiced composure, but even his carefully controlled gait betrayed a slight hesitation. Poirot's gaze followed him like a fine-tuned instrument, noting every micro-expression, the tightening of fingers, the slight flicker of an eye as he scanned the room. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice calm but deliberate. "Tonight we bring clarity to confusion and truth to shadows." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the gathering. Hale attempted a polite smile, but it faltered under the intensity of Poirot's steady scrutiny. The detective continued, walking slowly around the table, his presence both commanding and precise. "You have acted with great care, monsieur, orchestrating events to conceal your intentions, manipulating those around you, creating false trails," and yet Poirot paused, lifting the mask slightly, all the while leaving behind the smallest traces, invisible to anyone not trained to see. "And these traces have led us here." Hale's fingers twitched involuntarily. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words adequate to meet Poirot's calm, implacable certainty. The detective's next step was subtle, almost theatrical. He retrieved a small notebook he had carried throughout the investigation. It contained the reconstruction of the night's events, the precise movements, the sequence of subtle gestures, and the repeated placement of objects, the pattern he had discerned. He placed it before Hale, the pages exposed, revealing the meticulous record of the villain's missteps. Poirot's voice softened, almost sympathetic. "You see, monsieur, if an obsession leaves behind a trail, no matter how carefully one tries to hide it, every hesitation, every adjustment, every carefully measured reaction, all of it speaks, and the little grey cells never lie." Hale's jaw tightened. For a moment, the man seemed poised to bolt, but the realization dawned that escape was impossible. The house, once a labyrinth of secrets, had become a cage, and every path had been anticipated by the detective. Poirot leaned closer, hands clasped, voice measured. "You have caused 2 deaths, you have manipulated those around you, and you have sought to control every element of perception in this house. Yet, even control has limits. And now, faced with the inevitability of exposure, you have a choice. Confess your deeds and allow justice to follow its course, or resist and reveal the depths to which desperation may drive you." For a tense moment, silence dominated the room. The rain tapped lightly against the windows, like a metronome marking the seconds. Then Hale's composure shattered, his shoulders slumped, and a single tremulous word escaped. Yes, it was a confession, halting but unmistakable, the acknowledgement of guilt and the revelation of the twisted desire that had driven him. Poirot observed every flicker of expression, every quiver in voice and limb, noting how obsession had transformed into fatal action. The inspector moved forward to secure Hale, and the remaining guests, though shaken, began to understand the full scope of the crimes. Poirot, still composed, replaced the mask on the table, its fixed smile now a silent witness to resolution rather than deception. The pattern was complete, the hidden motives revealed, and the villain finally constrained. The house, once filled with fear and uncertainty, breathed a tentative sigh of relief. Poirot lingered for a moment, surveying the room and its occupants, his mind already cataloguing the lessons of observation, psychology, and the human capacity for obsession. The final confrontation had passed, the truth laid bare, and Hawthorne House, for all its shadows and secrets, had yielded to the patient and unerring logic of the detective. The house had settled into an uneasy calm, The guests, though shaken by Mr. Hale's confession, were beginning to breathe again, their faces pale but relieved. Inspector Lavington had taken Hale into custody, and a sense of closure seemed to hover in the drawing-room. Poirot, standing near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, allowed the atmosphere to settle, though his keen mind remained alert. He had seen the threads of obsession, the pattern of movements, and the hidden motives all neatly tied up, or so it appeared. And yet, something tugged at the edge of his reasoning, a faint irregularity, an echo of movement, a hesitation in one of the guests that had not aligned with Hale's confession. His eyes scanned the room, settling on Mrs. Linton. The housekeeper had remained silent throughout the confrontation, her composure unwavering, yet there was a subtle stiffness in her posture, an almost imperceptible tightening of the lips whenever Hale had been mentioned. Her loyalty had seemed absolute, her fear genuine, yet Poirot's intuition whispered that there was more to her silence than simple caution. He approached her quietly, with the softest of steps. "Madam Linton," he said gently, "we have learned much today, have we not? And yet, the human heart often holds more than a single secret." She flinched slightly at the words, glancing toward the door, as though weighing an escape. Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Tell me, then, about the night of the criminaut, what you saw, but what you knew, and what you thought you could conceal." A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. The truth, it seemed, was a burden she had carried carefully. Slowly, deliberately, she began to speak. Her account revealed a twist no one had anticipated. Hale had indeed orchestrated much of the deception, but he had acted under pressure. There had been another presence behind the scenes, someone even more calculating, someone who had manipulated events from the shadows, someone who understood Hale's obsession and had used it to their advantage. Poirot listened intently, every detail falling into place. The missing letter, the placement of objects, even the cryptic messages left in the library, they had all been part of a larger design, one orchestrated not solely by Hale, but by a figure no one had considered suspect. Miss Clara Benton, her connection to the old family scandal, her knowledge of the house, her subtle reactions throughout questioning all now revealed a deeper, more sinister intelligence. She had leveraged Hale's obsession, guiding him toward acts he thought were of his own volition, ensuring that suspicion would fall elsewhere while she remained invisible. Poirot turned toward her, his gaze steady, his expression calm but penetrating. "Mademoiselle Benton," he said softly, "you have been most clever. You allowed others to act, to take the blame, while you ensured the threads of control remained in your hands. Yet even the most meticulous plan leaves traces. You misjudged the pattern, believing the small details of movement would remain unnoticed, but the little grey cells see all." Benton's lips parted, shock giving way to a cold, calculating glare. "You can't prove anything," she whispered, a faint tremor betraying the tension beneath her calm. Poirot's smile was slight but assured. "Proof is not always in words alone. It is in the consistency of actions, the sequence of gestures, the logic of opportunity and motive. You have orchestrated deception on multiple levels, yet every step, every movement has left an imprint. And tonight, the pattern speaks plainly." The room seemed to constrict around her, the weight of exposure palpable. Lavington, who had returned to hear the revelation, moved forward to apprehend her. Miss Benton's attempt at denial faltered, her carefully maintained poise cracking under the precision of Poirot's reasoning. The last-minute twist the true mastermind revealed shattered the illusion of closure. Poirot stepped back, hands folded, eyes calm as the room's tension dissolved into stunned realization. The case, once thought concluded with Hale's confession, had demanded one final exercise of the detective's genius, and as the rain continued its gentle patter against the windows, the full complexity of Hawthorne House's tragedy lay bare, leaving no shadow unexamined, no motive unexposed, and no mask unlifted. The house had fallen into a tense silence. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle, leaving the ground slick and glistening under the dim lanterns, while inside, the gravity of revelation pressed upon every occupant. Miss Benton, now unmasked as the true mastermind, was under the watchful eyes of Inspector Lavington, yet there remained a glint of defiance in her expression, a suggestion that even confinement could not entirely quell. Poirot stood apart, calm, poised, his gaze sweeping the room as though measuring not only the people within it, but the very atmosphere itself. "Messamis," he said softly, almost conversationally, "we have seen the lengths to which human desire and obsession may drive one. Yet, even in the most intricate scheme, there are threads, almost imperceptible, that betray the mind behind it. It is for this reason, and this reason alone, that the guilty are revealed." He gestured to the mask on the table, its blank smile now a silent symbol of the hidden machinations it had accompanied. The mask was not merely a diversion. It was a signal, a psychological lever, a way of controlling perception. Its placement, its proximity to the objects of focus, all were calculated to mislead and to manipulate. Poirot walked slowly around the room, eyes lingering on the slight depressions in the carpet, the angles of the chairs, the faintly disturbed objects that only a trained observer could notice. The letter, initially stolen, was of course intended to appear crucial, to draw attention to the wrong individual. The second incident, the toppling of the bookcases, was a calculated escalation designed to create fear and confusion and to confirm suspicions elsewhere. But all of this, he said, lifting the notebook in which he had meticulously recorded observations, was orchestrated with the purpose of hiding the subtle guiding hand of the true culprit. Miss Benton's face paled slightly, though her composure remained outwardly intact. Poirot's gaze, unyielding, rested upon her. "You allowed Mr. Hale to believe himself in control, to act upon his obsession with Madame Hawthorne, believing he was executing your intentions independently. Yet every move he made, every hesitation, every glance, every carefully placed object was shaped by your silent guidance. And in doing so, you left behind the smallest errors, the inconsistencies that only the keenest observation could reveal." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Observe closely, and you will see. The tiny deviations in behavior, the subtle gestures, the repeated patterns in all spoke louder than confession ever could. Miss Benton, your cleverness was undone by the very details you assumed would escape notice. And that," he said with a faint smile, "is why the little grey cells triumph." Inspector Lavington moved forward to take Benton into custody. The mastermind's defiance lingered only in the fleeting resistance of a glance before she allowed herself to be led away, the final act of control slipping through her fingers. The guests exhaled, a mixture of relief and residual apprehension washing over them. Hawthorne House, with all its shadows and secrets, was at last exposed, its darkness illuminated by patient logic. Poirot lingered by the window, observing the wet garden beyond. "Justice has been served," he murmured softly, "yet one must always remain aware. Human cunning is rarely extinguished entirely. Even the most brilliant mind may seek avenues unseen, opportunities for manipulation." He turned back to the room, now quiet, filled only with lingering echoes of fear and revelation. Every detail, the misaligned chair, the subtle footsteps, the micro-expressions unnoticed by ordinary observers, these were the keys. And it is by seeing what others overlook that the truth may be unveiled, even when all seems hidden. Outside, the rain began to lighten further, the storm passing but leaving a glistening world in its wake. Inside, the house felt different, lighter yet still charged with the memory of its recent horrors. Poirot's task was complete. The guilty were apprehended, the motives revealed, and the deception unravelled. Yet in the stillness there remained a subtle unease, a reminder that the human mind is capable of cleverness and darkness alike, and that, sometimes, the shadows of one's own cleverness may linger longer than expected. Poirot left the drawing-room quietly, his coat brushing lightly against the polished floor, the low murmur of the remaining guests fading behind him. Outside, the drizzle had softened into a gentle mist, the gardens of Hawthorne House glistening under the faint light of lanterns. He walked slowly along the gravel path, hands clasped behind his back, mind still turning over the intricate threads of the case. The house seemed calm now, almost serene, yet his sharp eyes caught the slightest disturbances in the foliage. Subtle shifts that suggested the night's events had left traces beyond the obvious. Even with both Hale and Miss Benton apprehended, a faint unease lingered in Poirot's thoughts. The investigation had revealed the mastermind, the motive, and the method, yet the detective's instincts were rarely so completely satisfied. He paused at the edge of the garden, observing a solitary bloom bent beneath the weight of rain, the detail almost too trivial to note. And yet, in the quiet perfection of its placement, he saw a question, a slight irregularity in the sequence of the day's events. Something, somewhere, had been overlooked, a subtle clue that refused to settle neatly into the narrative he had reconstructed. He retraced the path in his mind, revisiting the evening's revelations. The mask, the letters, the toppling bookcase, the slip of paper left in Wentworth's hand, they had all been accounted for, yet there had been one final message, delivered not in words but in subtle timing. The minute shift in the chair where Miss Benton had lingered, the fleeting glance toward the study door just as Hale moved, even the placement of the lantern in the hallway, they formed a pattern that did not entirely align with the master plan he had uncovered. It was a whisper of something more, perhaps another layer of calculation that had escaped the participants themselves. Poirot smiled faintly, a small curve of amusement touching his lips. "Ah, but mes amis," he murmured to the empty gardens, "one must never assume the human mind will be fully contained, or that every secret has been exhausted. Even in the most complete solution, there remain shadows, faint as echoes, that may point to future disturbances. The little grey cells are content with the present, yet they remain vigilant, for the game of observation is never truly finished." He turned back toward the house, noting the soft glow of candlelight in drawing-room windows, the gentle stirrings of the household settling after the chaos. The guests were weary but reassured, confident that justice had been delivered. And yet, Poirot knew that the surface calm of Hawthorne House was deceptive. The human heart, driven by ambition, desire, and secrecy, could never be entirely predicted. Somewhere in the quiet corridors, in the subtle movements unnoticed, a question remained, a puzzle waiting to emerge. As he reached the carriage waiting at the edge of the drive, Poirot paused, letting the cool mist curl around him. His mind sifted through the last irregularities, the tiny gestures and patterns that did not fully resolve. Perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps it was the seed of the next case, an enigma lying dormant, ready to be awakened. The detective's eyes gleamed with the familiar spark of anticipation, for even the conclusion of one mystery is merely the prelude to another. The carriage door closed softly, and as Poirot was driven away from Hawthorne House, he allowed himself a final reflection. The case was solved, the guilty apprehended, the motives revealed, but the world remained full of secrets, hidden in the smallest gestures, the faintest shadows. The cryptic messages overlooked by all but the keenest observer. And for a mind like Poirot's, that promise of the next challenge, of the next puzzle yet to be unraveled, was far more exhilarating than any conclusion could ever be. Even as the carriage rolled down the misty drive, the house behind him seemed to breathe, holding its mysteries close, whispering that while justice had been served tonight, the game of observation, deception, and human ingenuity would never truly end.